appreciate the opportunity to moderate today's session. I think it's a great kind of follow-up to the strategic discussion we just had to talk about what are the real-world implications we've seen from the ongoing trade war that we've had with China. So, I think we all know that despite comments going off this administration, trade wars are not fast and easy to win. We certainly are seeing impacts throughout the economy on a wide range of sectors of folks who rely on trade with China, not just on the import side, but on the exports as well. So, despite hearing some comments from certain administration officials, while the economy is booming, we are starting to see and read daily impacts from folks that are feeling the pain from tariffs and from retaliation. So this panel, we're going to discuss the impact of the tariffs on the overall economy, as well as the impact on tech and agriculture, and we'll get into other issues as well. Although I think most of us recognize that industries across the board are starting to feel the pain from the tariffs. Everybody from manufacturers to retailers to tech to services are all starting to see the impact. And the biggest pain, I think the biggest problem we're seeing is just the continued uncertainty. And how do you plan for that uncertainty going forward? We certainly hope that a deal comes forward soon, but for companies who are trying to plan their business for the next 6, 9, 12 months or longer, this makes it very difficult for them to do that planning. So we'll talk about some of the impacts folks are seeing as well as talk about some of the mitigation strategies that companies are trying to put into place. So we'll go ahead and introduce our panel. We have their bios in front of you, but I'll do a quick introduction. To my immediate right, we have Chad Bound, who's the Reginald Jones Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. If you're not following Chad on Twitter, he's a must to follow on Twitter. I think I retweet 2 or 3 of your tweets every day. But it's good stuff. Next we have Simon Rogers, who's the Executive Vice President for Public Advocacy at CompTIA. And then finally we have Joe Glover, who's the Senior Research Fellow with the International Food Policy Research Institute and former Chief Economist of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So we're going to have each of our panelists give just a couple minutes, introduction, some initial thoughts, and then we'll get into some Q&A and return to the audience for some questions too. So, Chad, let's start.
So thanks to WITA for the opportunity to be here and to John for moderating. So what I thought I would do to lead off is to tell the story of the trade war so far, and primarily get the facts out there on the table, because I think it's important to do so to sort of understand where we are and how we got there. So the first thing is, for those of us, and you're in this boat with me, it feels like the trade war has been going on forever. Every day for a year and a half, almost 2 years now, and it seems like it's epic. But in many respects, it hasn't been. And so let's just remember how we got here. We did have tariffs on solar panels and washing machines that went into effect in February of 2018. The steel and aluminum tariffs started to go on in March of 2018. And then we had the rollout of the tariffs on China beginning in July and August and ultimately September of 2018. But even if we just think about and focus on the China tariffs, how they were rolled out is kind of important. And I mention this because if you were to say, if you were to transport yourself back in time 2 years ago and say to yourself, all right, 2 years from now, so by the end of 2019, we're going to have tariffs on somewhere between 15 and 30% on basically everything the United States imports from China. So $500 billion worth of stuff. China is going to retaliate it in kind. And yet, the U.S. economy, I'm not going to say it's booming. I'm not going to use John's words. I'll quibble with you a little bit there. But the U.S. economy is doing okay. Financial markets haven't panicked. You probably would have said, no way. Right? No way. And yet that's effectively where we could find ourselves by December 15th. Who knows what will happen in October, but that's very well how we could find ourselves. But part of that, I think, is how they rolled out the tariffs. It seems like this has been going on for a long time, and it has. But initially, when they started applying the tariffs to China, they did it very deliberately. So the $34 billion, the $16 billion, there was a lead up. These things are coming, so companies have the ability to get some of them in before the tariffs go on. The $200 billion, same sort of story. The $200 billion was only 10%, so they started off at relatively low levels. And also the products on the list were not the products that we're going to see starting to get hit with tariffs, both now and in December. The initial rounds of tariffs were primarily on intermediate inputs. So stuff that companies buy to make other things, stuff that companies can potentially source from other places, stuff that companies can then change up their input mix, things that companies perhaps can stockpile. They have a little bit more flexibility. Maybe they pass prices on to end consumers. Maybe they keep wages down. They have a bit more flexibility there. And so it's not all that surprising that we haven't seen huge, massive effects, I think, showing up in the US economy yet. That combined with the fact that, you know, as open as we are in the US economy and as low as our trade barriers are, we don't actually trade all that much. In a sense, relative to our overall economy, we're primarily a services economy. And so in some respects, the fact, you know, so this is all to say, don't get mad at economists for saying you predicted we would have, you know, a recession and return to the Great Depression of the 1930s if we ever saw a whiff of tariffs. I think responsible people never said that. But if you're wondering why, you know, we haven't gotten there yet, I think that's part of the explanation. Obviously, some elements of that are going to change with both the tariffs that went on in September and the ones that we may see in December, as these are primarily hitting very different types of products from China. A lot of consumer goods, a lot of retail goods. So the September lists were primarily clothing and footwear. The December 15th list is a lot of consumer electronics, video games, toys, you know, things that we normally see consumers buy for the holiday season. In any case, when you look at how the trade war has been fought so far, and what the impact is on the US economy so far, and what it's likely to be in the future, and we'll get into more details of some of this, you know, I think there are economic explanations for it. That being said, while we haven't seen huge impacts on the overall economy yet, we are starting to see signs. You know, we had the manufacturers, the PMI released yesterday. I think that was not great news. Again, one data point, but something to look at there. And we're going to hear some of the distributional implications from the other panels today, especially in agriculture, when it comes to the story of retaliation. And then in sectors like tech, where it's, you know, a very different kind of story as well. Some of it's tariffs, but a lot of it's some of the other stuff going on too. So, you know, while we may not see it in the headline numbers in terms of economic activity, I think it definitely is being felt, you know, in various pockets out there throughout the economy, and there's likely more to come. So that I'll pass it on to the next one.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here representing the Computing Technology Industry Association. For those of you not familiar with our organization, we represent a cross-section of the IT and telecom sector, roughly 130 member companies, big, medium, and small. We're very focused on global trade and market access issues, export control and customs compliance, cybersecurity, and increasingly supply chain security, as well as issues such as privacy and workforce development. So again, very happy to be here to talk about the U.S.-China relationship, trade and tariffs, and of course how that's impacting our sector. So I'll start by saying that we are very appreciative that the administration is pushing back very hard on Chinese policies as it relates to intellectual property theft, forced technology transfer, WTO violations. The concern we have is this ramping up of tariffs, again, that we're all very well aware are raising costs for consumers and businesses. I think, you know, it's fair for us to relay some of the pushback that we've given in comments to USTR and others. Again, making the case for why these tariffs are eventually going to be hitting consumers. I know there's been some companies that are able to absorb these costs in the short term, but over the long term, as these negotiations drag out, it's making that more difficult. Just to give a sense of scope, the total tariffs paid on tech product imports from China increased from $383 million in 2017 to $1.9 billion in 2018. So that's over a five-fold increase since the Section 301 tariffs were levied. Should a 30% tariff rate apply to all tech imports from China for the remainder of the year, that cost could run into the tens of billions of dollars. And again, we appreciate that USTR has pulled back some of the tariffs just as recently as yesterday. Unfortunately, those are temporary and just there's still too many items on those lists. We are seeing that, again, U.S. companies have a lot of anxiety about losing market share to foreign competitors, and of course, even prices for government procurement, even for the national security agencies, are ultimately going to be impacted. So bottom line, when we're advocating on this with the administration, we're very clear our view that we think these tariffs are causing irreparable harm for the American tech sector, for the 12 million Americans who work for our sector, and ultimately consumers and businesses who use tech in their everyday lives and businesses. So when we're looking at the specific lists, so we've got right now lists 1 through 3, we're at 25% and looking at potentially 30% in a matter of weeks, October 15th. And this is hitting everything from semiconductors, transmission devices that are used in Internet of Things. We've got data center parts and components, much more. So again, I think that list 1 through 3 going up to 30% in a matter of weeks is very concerning to our industry. I think it might be helpful just to give sort of a real-life example. So motion sensors are on list 2, high-definition cameras are on list 3. These are critical components used, for example, in home security systems that millions of Americans use to keep their families safe. So as the prices rise for those critical components, again, I think we can all agree that that's not an outcome that any of us would prefer. So now, of course, we're bracing for the impact of list 4. That's going to be the 15% that will be on end user consumer electronics and many others. So 4A went into effect in September. That impacted printers and scanners, speakers, computers, other than laptops and tablets. Again, as was just mentioned, we have list 4B that's going to hit in mid-December, right before the Christmas shopping season. For those of you that aren't procrastinators, mobile phones, laptops, tablets, keyboards, video game consoles, all of those will be on that December list. So how are our members reacting? So we are hearing that, again, as these negotiations drag out, there's a lot of concern. There's certainly discussions about moving supply chains and manufacturing out of China. Many companies are able to absorb the costs now, and they're trying to do so, but many are having to pass those costs along now. So CompTIA, we've been really redoubling our efforts to push for a deal sooner than later. I think we all, and this is, again, was mentioned on the first panel, we're all very concerned about the timing. We have an election year coming up, as we all know. The primaries are in February of 2020. It's much more difficult on the American side. We have complications such as the extradition hearing in Canada for Huawei's CFO happening in January of 2020. That's going to raise the anxiety on the Chinese side. And again, as was mentioned on the previous panels, as security and human rights issues continue, concerns around that continue to rise. Conflation with the trade negotiations are certainly likely. So again, bottom line for us, we hope that our countries can reach a deal soon that achieves real structural reforms, that protects American innovation, intellectual property, brings stability back to our relationship with China and the global economy, and that eventually we can get back to working together with our allies collectively.
Well, great. And let me thank everyone for the invitation to speak on this as well. As Chad mentioned, agriculture is a sector that's been hit pretty hard by these tariffs. And to put it in context, China, if you look over the last 10 years, China, on average, has been the #1 export destination for U.S. agricultural products. I mean, this has been dominated by soybeans. China imports roughly 2/3 of the world's trade in soybeans. This is to fuel livestock, hog, poultry production in the country to meet growing demand for meat. But it has been the market maker in world soybean markets. And for the U.S., that means roughly 1 out of 4, 1 out of 3 acres planted in the U.S. That production's harvested and shipped to China over the last 10 years. That all came to an abrupt halt with the imposition of tariffs. Interestingly, back in, I guess, May of 2018, Secretary Ross was at the press club talking about potential trade wars with China, and he said, yeah, China has to eat. They're gonna continue to import, and Brazil can't step up and do it all. So the U.S. won't be hurt that much, and whatever victory China may have is Pyrrhic, because they'll be facing higher food costs. Some of that's true, certainly for a variety of factors, not just the trade war, but because of a disease that's swept through the hog population in China. They've seen very, very high inflation rates. But where he was wrong is the fact that Brazil actually was able to step up, and Brazil increased exports to China by about 13 million tons. If you saw the spread between prices in the U.S. and China when those tariffs went on, we saw about a $3 bushel difference between prices in Brazil, much, much higher, as China was trying to buy everything out of there relative to the U.S. Now, the U.S. did pick up other markets, markets like the EU, which had been an important market for the U.S. in the 70s. We started doing a little bit more business there. But remember, these are mature markets. And they're nowhere the size of China. But more importantly, I think, and this gets to the longer run aspects of this issue, is the longer this trade war is prolonged, you get a $3 differential between the U.S. and Brazil. That gives a lot of incentives to plant more soybeans in Brazil. And we did see about 1 million more hectare come in last year, expecting another 1 million hectare this year of additional soybeans. That differential, by the way, has come down as we have had this rapprochement with China over various times and sold a little bit of soybeans there. But it started to increase again because this is the period, we're coming into harvest for the U.S. It's the period when we normally would ship most of our soybeans out the door. In fact, the first 3 or 4 or 5, 6 months, that's when all those exports occur, and then China takes over, or Brazil would step into the market. The long run concerns I have about this is that, one, it brings a lot more land into production in Brazil, and that comes at the expense of soybean production here in this country. This year, it was an odd year because of the wet spring, but which normally would mean more soybean area because corn is the crop that's really hurt by a lot of moisture early in the spring. But in fact, soybean acreage fell, which you'd expect because of the high price, the low prices for soybeans. But more importantly, I think, is the infrastructure development. Everyone who's been to Brazil knows that despite the fact they have this juggernaut of an agricultural sector that produces very low-cost food, they have a very difficult time getting it out the door. So the port facilities are backed up every harvest in the southern part of the country. And that's where I think that over the longer run, if money goes into that to improve infrastructure, I think that's a problem. Moreover, you have the northeastern ports that are starting to be developed, and there is China money in there trying to develop those ports. If those ports develop, then Brazil will be able to ship out through the Panama Canal, which is a vast cheaper way of getting a product to China rather than going around the Horn of Africa. So these are all really big concerns, I think, about long-run implications of a trade war. But even within China itself, I think what we've seen over the last year is a more efficient feeding of soybean meal. Because of high grain prices internally, oftentimes soybeans, the soybean meal is typically added to rations to improve protein or to give them protein consumption, less so calories. That's normally done by grain. And so they tended to feed, because grain prices were high, a lot more protein meal than what you see in typical rations, say here in the U.S. or other places around the world. That all became a lot more efficient over the last year as well. And so I think at the end there's a little bit of demand destruction that way, but also far more worrisome to me is what it does for competitors like Brazil and even places like Ukraine and others that have begun to produce more soybeans over the last few years.
Great, thanks everybody. So now we'll get into a little more of a discussion here. So Chad, we heard from Cindy about the tariff impact on the tech sector, five-fold increase over the past year and a half. As we look at the global impact we've seen through the tariff tracker, the tariff hurts that Heartland's been putting out, we're well over $33 billion that's been collected thus far because of the trade war. July alone had $6.8 billion, the highest month in tariff, highest tariffs we've ever seen collected by the U.S. By the way, paid by U.S. importers, not paid by China or anybody else. Let's state that up front so everybody understands that, a clear understanding who's actually paying the tariffs. But talk about the economic impact to date that you've seen. I know you've done a lot of research on this, but from your perspective, what's the impact thus far?
So I think that's a good point to make. On the tariff revenue piece of this, I looked at this summer, so this is not the most accurate numbers, but despite the massive amount of tariff revenue that we're now collecting because of these tariffs, the idea that tariff revenue might somehow fund federal government expenditures is not credible, right? So the last time I looked, it was still 2.5% or so, maybe 3% of federal tax collections, even after all of this stuff. So this is just not a good motive for these kinds of policies. Systemically, John, you're exactly right. And so the economic research in this question of who pays the tariff, yes, it is the importers. They're in charge of sort of turning in the money. But also the bigger question of, is it being passed on to American consumers in the form of higher prices, or American businesses in terms of reduced profits, or are Chinese firms, Chinese exporters, being forced to lower their prices in order to stay in the U.S. market? The evidence that we have seen so far is the former, that it's primarily Americans that are bearing the burden, the tax incidence, as economists call it, of these tariffs. That may change over the long term as companies have greater opportunities to switch and make decisions, but we haven't seen any evidence of that impact yet. I think one other point that I wanted to make about how we're seeing the impact of all of this, Joe talked importantly about how China has retaliated and the impact that it's having on the American farm community, and that has been a lot of what their retaliation is focused on. But it's also important to think more broadly about how China has structured its retaliation. It hasn't retaliated to the same extent the United States has imposed tariffs. Now, some of that's obvious because China doesn't import as much from us as we import from them, so it couldn't go one for one, even if it wanted to. But when you look at the structure of China's actual retaliation, it's very muted. They could have done a lot more than they did. So when I, as an economist, look at that, I ask why, and think, well, probably it's out of recognition. They recognize there are costs to yourself of imposing these tariffs. And so what they have done is not only keep their tariffs, their retaliatory tariffs, at lower rates, they've stayed away from products for which there are no good alternatives. So soybeans, there are good alternatives in Brazil, but for products like aircraft, some of the higher end semiconductors, they've stayed away from those completely, recognizing that there aren't a lot of good plan Bs out there for them. And the second thing that China has done that's quite distinct is they've actually been lowering their tariffs toward imports coming in from the rest of the world. So for all of you trade geeks and WTO aficionados, that's their MFN tariffs, right? They've cut those essentially by 25%, and it's not just on a handful of products, it's on lots and lots of different products. So this is to offset the cost to their own consumers, make it easier for them to go out and find an alternative supplier, aside from those unreliable Americans. Go find a Canadian, a European, a Japanese supplier instead. Will help you overcome the costs of having to switch. So China's response to how it's engaging in the trade war, I think, is very different, and thus is having a very different overall impact on both their economy and on the U.S. economy, and how it's also feeding through in the